walloping effects on people.
That's fantastic advice. I mean, it's just it's so logical, and it sounds so great. I mean, I think that's one of the gigantic problems that a lot of people have with education, that you're learning facts, you're learning information, but you're not learning how to use your own mind.
Yeah, well, here's something that's really interesting about that. So I spent a lot of time, I'm a scientist, but I would say I'm also a religious person. I'm a deeply religious person. And
how do you reconcile those?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, and I've spent 40 years thinking about that. And for 20 of those years, I did almost nothing but think about that all the time. And I realized something, partly from reading Carl Jung. And what I realized was that even the fundamentalists have the wrong idea about religious truth. Religious truth is not scientific truth. Like the stories in Genesis, which are very old stories, maybe tens of thousands of years old. They're obviously not scientific theories because the people who wrote them weren't scientists. We didn't have science until about 500 years ago. So the idea that the stories in Genesis are scientific theories is just false on every possible front. And so then you might say, well, there's no other truth but scientific truth. It's like, well, wait a minute. That's not true. Because what scientific truth tells you is what things are. But genuine religious truth tells you how you should act. And those things are not the same. And so a great story, like a great novel, which is a quasi-religious construction because it's like a distillation of ordinary life into its most important elements. That's a map about how you should comport yourself in the world. And you might say, well, what do you mean by should? And because that's the question the moral relativists ask. And there's an answer to that too, as far as I can tell. And I got this partly from reading Jean Piaget. So imagine that here's how you should act. You should act so that things are good for you like they would be for someone you're taking care of. But they have to be good for you in a way that's also good for your family. And they have to be good for you and your family in a way that's also good for society. And maybe even also good for the broader environment, if you can manage that. So it's balanced at all those levels. And then that has to be good for you and your family and society and the world right now and next week and next month and a year from now and 10 years from now. And so it's this harmonious balancing of multiple layers of being simultaneously. And that's a Darwinian reality, I would say. Your brain is actually attuned to tell you when you're doing that. And the way it tells you is that it reveals that what you're doing is meaningful. That's the sign that your nervous system is adapted to do this. It's adapted to exist, I would say, on the edge between order and chaos. And chaos is where things are so complex you can't handle it, and order is where things are so rigid that it's too restrictive. In between that, there's a place that's meaningful, where you're partly stabilized and partly curious, and you're operating in a manner that increases your scope of knowledge. So you're inquiring and growing, and at the same time you're stabilizing and renewing you, your family, society, nature, now, next week, next month, and next year. And when you have an intimation of meaning, then you know you're there. And I can give you an existential demonstration of that. So imagine that each of these levels of existence, the way I just laid them out, are like patterns. They're patterns within patterns within patterns within patterns. And there's a way of making all that harmonious. That's what music models. That's why music is so meaningful. You know, you take a beautiful orchestral composition, and all the instruments are doing different things at different levels, but they all flow together harmoniously, and you're right in the middle of that as a listener, and it fills you with a sense of, it's almost like a sense of religious awe, even if you're a punk rock nihilist, you know. And the reason for that is because the music is modeling the manner of being that's harmonious. It's the proper way to exist. And religious writings, in the deepest sense, so those are archetypal writings, are guidelines to that mode of being. So they're not true like scientific truth is true. I think of them as they're hyper true or meta true. It's like we take the most true things about your life, and then we take the most true things about 10 other people's lives, and we amalgamate them into a single figure, and that would be like a literary hero. And then we take 1,000 literary heroes, and we extract out from each of them what makes the most heroic person. That's a religious deity. That's what Christ is. He's a meta hero. And that sits at the bottom of Western civilization. And his archetypal mode of being is true speech. That's the fundamental idea of Western civilization. And it's right.